Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It is a great pleasure to moderate this dialogue today, which really marks a moment of a great visibility of Louise Bourgeois in Asia, because there are like 4 institutions that have major exhibition of her work, starting from Fubon in Taiwan, Mori Museum in Japan, Hoa soon in Korea, and the presence in Khao Forest in Thailand. And the context where the work of an artist is installed always changes and offers new perspectives about how the work is presented and installed. And today we celebrate really the opening of a new beautiful exhibition of Louise Bourgeois in Hauser Wirth Gallery, curated by Philip Larratt-Smith. This is the second exhibition of Louise Bourgeois in Hong Kong, in the gallery, and you chose the title of Soft Landscapes, which I think is already containing like a contradiction that explains very well the vocation of Louise Bourgeois. Probably you could explain how you came up with this theme and with this title.
Thank you, Stefano. We feel very lucky to be presenting this exhibition of Louise's work at this time in Hauser Wirth Hong Kong, because Louise is having a kind of an East Asian moment. There was a show at the Mori Art Museum in Tokyo that has now traveled to the Fubon Art Museum in Taiwan called I Have Been to Hell and Back, and Let Me Tell You It Was Wonderful. This is an exploration of Louise's psychic journey, her struggles to reconcile her relationships with her mother and father, and her journey towards a kind of artistic salvation through making art. So art is a guarantee of sanity. One of Louise's most famous sayings is the idea that art isn't a permanent cure, but it offers a way for you to survive and to continue. A version of this show will be reimagined for the Hoa Museum in Seoul. It will open there in August. And the current show, Soft Landscape, is Louise's second in Hong Kong. The first show was called My Own Voice Wakes Me Up, and it consisted of a very bright and red palette of many of Louise's red gouaches that she made in the last 4 years of her life, and an assortment of sculptures that related to this theme. It was very much centered around family relations. And the current show, when I first started thinking about what to do in Hong Kong, I wanted it to be very different and to show Louise's range as an artist and to showcase other aspects of her work. And in fact, we're very lucky to have several pieces that have never been exhibited before. And the show is organized as a kind of loose narrative, but not really with a central thread. I think of it almost, one of Louise's favorite forms was the spiral. She felt that her own artistic development followed the form of a spiral. And so it is moments of return, motifs that appear in the first gallery will turn up again in the fourth gallery, and so on. And the idea of soft landscape comes from a work that Louise made in 1968. In the 60s, Louise was experimenting with poured forms, working in latex and resin. She was later seen as a kind of forerunner of the tendency that became known as post-minimalism, a reaction against, even a rebellion against the strictures of high minimalism. And the idea of soft landscape was that the human body is a soft landscape. So Louise uses landscape as a metaphor for the human body, and vice versa. But landscape is also a metaphor for the inner psychic reality of Louise, which she is always striving to express. And the body becomes positioned as a kind of envelope between inner and outer reality. And the predominant iconography is one of holes and cavities and mounds and water, the passage of time symbolized by water. And these 4 interlocking dialogues that you'll see in the gallery show make up a much more focused look at this motif in Louise's work. So it's really a kind of very focused exhibition compared to, say, the show that's at Fubon now, which is a broader cross-section of all periods of Louise's production. So the palette is generally cooler, and where the family and family iconography predominated in the earlier show, this is more about Louise confronting the landscape directly, or even images of the landscape without her, and isolated landscapes as well.
Landscape is a crucial theme in art in Asia, in China specifically. Do you think about references to historic Chinese paintings? Or?
Well, I mean, that would be beyond my pay grade. I'm afraid I'm not. I know very little about the traditions of Chinese landscape painting, but I'm aware that of the importance of the genre, and I thought it would be interesting also to bring Louise into, not into juxtaposition, but into relation to that. And I think that's part of the strength of this show and why I hope it resonates with the public here, that her landscapes will be read differently in this cultural context.
This is extremely interesting because it contextualizes the work of Louise Bourgeois in Asian context. And it's wonderful to even introduce the other speaker today, Ulf from Beyeler Foundation, who is representing like the eve of another development of Louise Bourgeois perspective, because there is an important exhibition that is taking place in the Beyeler in the near future. Probably you can describe some of the ideas you would like to discover, reveal about her work.
Well, first of all, thank you for letting me speak here. It's really great. And before I speak about this show, I might mention something about what I saw today in this beautiful show at Hauser Wirth. It's really astonishing how often you feel that you haven't seen parts of her work before. It's not only because they found something something new or something not shown or not overexposed, if you like. But it's really interesting to see this body of work with some very spectacular highlights, like this fountain, the wonderful room with these hanging pieces, which is very inspirational for me because I'm working on a room with hanging pieces at the Basel 2027 summer show. And these wonderful landscape works, which are sort of making the landscape three-dimensional. I mean, Louise Bourgeois was very well aware of art history, and she knew, of course, what landscape in European art history means. It's a stable thing, you know. It's our stable idea of nature. Nature is always changing, and she's doing these kind of interestingly stable landscapes on the verge. They have these soft frames inside, and then she becomes three-dimensional. It's very poetic, and no one ever. I've never seen these pieces before, and it's really again something new, but really it's a kind of eye opener how she very freely deals with long established ideas of art history, for example, and of course the fountain in the back is a great piece, and I thought the two snake prints are really spectacular. Anyway, the show I'm working on has something to do with her relation to her husband. Robert Goldwater was a very important art historian. He taught at the Institute of Fine Arts for a long time. He was professor there, and she was married to him from 1938 to 1973 when he passed away. And at some point in her career, they wrote a lot of letters, and that was when she went to Italy. She was, correct me, Philip. I mean, she had this phase of depression in the 50s. This had something to do with the passing of her father and so on, and she didn't do anything for many years, and then she slowly broke away of this, and we see this in the show because there are these hanging pieces. These are these pieces which are sort of inwardly oriented, and hung pieces, which means they are sort of presented to the outside. It's a very interesting thing, and during the 60s, she's leaving her husband for work, not really leaving her husband. They stay married, but it's, I think, the first time that she goes away on her own to Europe and work and experiments freely in Pietrasanta and Carrara. And she develops things she mainly did before. She had a whole repertoire of work which she worked on, and she discovered marble as a material, which we see in the show, this wonderful labyrinth tower, which she worked on many times, and she developed different sizes. An interesting thing, and the show of the Beyeler will actually take the 60s as point of departure, and but I think it will cover most of her, many aspects of her work, and it would be sad to not include, for example, very, very early work or the very late drawings and prints, and so hope you all come to Switzerland in 2027 during the art fair, Basel. Not bad timing, I think. Yeah. Hopefully.
It is very interesting how Louise Bourgeois constantly plays with systematic contradictions. You know, the landscape is something that you assume is hard outside us, and you show the softness of it, and you show that it's not really outside us, it's the projection of her psyche outside. You talk about gravity, but most of the works that are suspended are made of very heavy materials, sometimes rubber, sometimes aluminum, sometimes even lead, the heaviest metal. She deliberately puts together things that should not be together or that we do not associate to really reveal the inner contradiction of reality. And this happens in many instances, male and female. She holds a phallic symbol and she calls him fillette, little girl. The spider, the mammon, is a nest and cage at the same time. I would like probably that both of you could really unfold some of these deliberate contradictions that are at the center of our work.
Yeah, I think looking at the image that's on the screen, this work, Labyrinthine Tower, which is in marble, comes from the second of two phases that Louise had in Italy. The first was in 1967 to 1972. As Ulf said, this was a period when Louise had gone through a kind of season in hell where she had really been immersed in psychoanalysis. She stopped completing works of art for several years, and then returned with an entirely new body of work that was completely different from what she had done before. And I think this is part of the reason why it took critics so long to appreciate Louise, because it was confounding to try to reconcile the personages of the 40s and 50s with these new soft sculptures that eventually give way to marble and bronze works later in the decade. And Labyrinthine Tower embodies some of these seemingly irreconcilable contradictions in Louise's work. And much of my interest in Louise derives from is psychoanalytic in nature. I'm interested in what Louise has to tell us about the nature of the human mind, but also Louise's specific psychological or pathological profile. And so holding two things in tension that don't belong together is a sign of ambivalence. And I think a lot of Louise's work is organized around this idea of expressing ambivalence. I love you, I hate you at the same time. Emotional states that are confusing and contradictory and that don't necessarily succumb to rational examination, but are nonetheless true, or are true for Louise. So a work like Labyrinthine Tower, the title Labyrinthine, a labyrinth is an interior mage, tower is something exterior, so she's taking something on the inside and putting it on the outside and vice versa. And the tower is ascending around an emptiness, a void, so there's a combination of volume and empty space. This is a work that has these kind of compacted, abstracted rather geometries, but at the same time, it's highly bodily. It's suggestive. It could be seen as phallic, or if you look at the top of the sculpture, you can sort of make it out. On the other side, rather, of the head, there are these finger-like forms that come down. So even though this is a more abstract piece for Louise, the body is never far away. And in fact, it's less a contradiction than a sign that Louise's mind, when she's working, is going in both directions at once. So.
And what is the role of materiality in the way you read her work?
Funny thing, I'm seeing a lot of shows lately of work, and I went to Barcelona and had a show on Louise and colleagues who worked in Carrara and Pietrasanta in Italy in the marbles, and it was a show centered around Barbara Hepworth more. And Barbara Hepworth and Henry Moore and Isa Monoguchi, and and Louise Bourgeois. In fact, people she met in Italy. One has to keep in mind she was not well known at that point. At that time, she was more or less someone not recognized. But she moved in these circles, and of course she knew who she was talking with and all that. And all these other colleagues were working of making the heaviness and the gravity of marble unseen. They just wanted to surpass this and sort of like making it look light. And she was the only one that was very striking at the show in Barcelona. She was the only one who worked on gravity. She made pieces like that piece. I mean, it's very heavy and it stands and it sort of finds it falls into places. You know, it's growing, but it's sort of it's collapsing in a way, as do many other pieces like Sleep, which is now on show in the Faubourg Art Museum, and this wonderful piece Germinal, which she makes pieces and she just puts them on a table or on the floor, and they find the way to sort of to rest, you know, and she plays with stability and instability, and that of course has a very psychological meaning as well. But she seems to be very interested in the materiality of the piece she's working on. I mean, she's interested in the heaviness of lead, you know. And got these wonderful aluminum hanging pieces, which are very heavy, but sort of suggest a kind of lightness. It's an interesting thing to think about, and I think my show in 2027 will very much sort of keep that in mind. This kind of take on material.
Yeah. I think that this beautiful intuition of the materiality of the web offers a beautiful interpretation of the presence of this fantastic set of drawings in the gallery in Hauser Wirth now. In a way, the spider constructs its own landscape. You know, through the web, you know, in biology, the territory is what keeps an animal alive. I loved in this set of drawings the fact that the web that Louise Bourgeois constructs is capable of detecting phrases, words, flowers, little spiders that are like snakes that are almost like semen. It becomes really the territory of the landscape of the spider. This is very interesting that it is not something given outside us, but the landscape is something that she constructs constantly. She constructs and she rearticulates in the form of a web. Is it a legitimate interpretation?
Well, I think if you think about Louise's, even her later cells, Hauser Wirth will have a cell on display in its booth at the fair. The cells are Louise is constructing an architecture in order to display the objects that she wants us to see, and it's an environment that's totally controlled. And so much of Louise's work seems to talk in a way about what is inside versus what is outside, both psychologically but even just physically. And in the work that you referenced, Time, I think the mark making is, I mean, I see it as a grid. These cross hatchings are like a grid, and the grid is really, you know, that's, you know, a kind of primary form of geometry and of 20th century painting, but it's highly eccentric, and the mark making is so subtle as to register each sort of shift in her consciousness. There's a lot of nervous energy in these pieces. The mark making is often, you know, very eccentric. The phrase is interesting. It means, the title is Time and Tide Waiting for No Man, and the French says, essentially, I have taken myself in hand. It means I have gotten myself under control. So the purpose of the work, in a way, what Louise is saying is that through this repetitive mark making of, you know, vertical, horizontal lines, she's getting herself in hand. She's taking control of herself. She often talked about needing to impose order on the chaos of her emotions. And I think the project of making one of these suites, there are 7 in total from 2003 that are like this, is primarily therapeutic for her. She's working off her anxiety through a simple and repetitive task. But that's not to say that the drawings are without visual interest, far from it. I think actually the minimal difference from line to line and from sheet to sheet is actually extremely rich and revealing. And to say that it's like a tapestry is not an exaggeration, because I think Louise was thinking, unconsciously maybe, of the tapestry restoration workshop of her childhood, and of the woof and the weft, how you organize the thread in order to weave a tapestry. So, the smaller details take on more salience in this sort of more contained project. And I think it's also a bit like a diary. And the work in general is like a diary. Louise is recording how she felt in the moment, about the things that were happening to her, about the relationships that she had with her husband, with her children, with other people who were close to her. And so the whole work has this book-like quality in a way, this diaristic quality. And I think this work contains that in a way, in a nutshell.
Look at the wonderful backgrounds. I mean, one should. She gives space to these grids. I think when you look at the bottom, the second from the right, this has this sort of, you know what I mean? This wonderful blue in behind. It's very. It's not just scribbling. It's very thought of, and it's very sort of very subtle drawing, really. Very fascinating, these things.
And it's important to point out these are double-sided drawings, so she drew on the backs as well. And in fact, for Louise, I don't think there was a front or a back. She just used both sides of the paper. So she chose this composition of 40, but there were really 80, you could say 80 drawn images. And that in and of itself is quite radical, I think, and quite beautiful. Yeah, and as Ulf said, it's not that, to say that she's working off her anxiety doesn't imply that it's just unconscious, or mechanical repetition. I think there are choices that she's making as she goes along that, may just have to do with color or may have to do with the quality of the line. But as always with Louise, it's also, I think, a bit like a polygraph. Like she can't help but record, what she's thinking and what's going on unconsciously. Yeah.
This becomes even a strategy to trap thoughts and ideas. This goes back to the idea of gravity and grace. Louise used to say that through drawings she was able to pin feathers of thoughts onto the canvas. So it's again about the lightness and the immediateness of the tool of drawings to really detect the lightness that the heaviness of the sculpture is not able to convey, or the heaviness of the painting. For this instance, how do you reframe the relationship between Louise Bourgeois and the text, for example? There was recently a beautiful exhibition curated by Jenny Hauser in Basel. Extraordinary show, really focusing on the relationship between Bourgeois and text. Is there something that resonates in your research on gravity as well?
Well, I mean, this is a very important question, and I don't think we have enough time to talk about this, but because that's really something interesting. I think that first of all, I don't believe in automatic drawing, so I'm criticizing Breton, which he did as well for a reason. And for many reasons, but I don't want to sort of go on with that. But it's there's nothing really automatic in her, because everything is really controlled, and I think there's always a sort of relation between the hand and the brain when you draw, and with Louise and seeing the letters she writes in a very distinct handwriting and writing all these thoughts and constantly writing. I mean, she's always sort of having a pen in the hand. She must have done that all day. I mean, like this or writing. There is not much difference. I mean, she's a wonderful writer as well as a wonderful draftswoman. So I wouldn't say that there is much distinction. And if you read the text and look at the drawings, then you see that the drawings, which are seemingly easy are that complicated. They're on the same level. It's sort of, you know, a text evokes thoughts, and one should see with time the drawings like you read the texts. And so there's one corner in the exhibition with this wonderful Ode à la Bièvre text part, where she recalls her childhood in that place south of Paris where she and her parents lived, and she recalls a pebble falling in a fountain, and the sound it makes. It's really beautiful. It's something. Well, when I began working on Louise, and I did this smallish show at the Basel in 2011. It was one of the works I wouldn't say which really involved me very emotionally, and that's there's drawing and writing on the same level, I think. I mean, but you need time, and you need to follow the lines here, and to see how that evolves, like the writing. So would you agree? Wouldn't you agree? It's
I think so. I think Louise's writings really they exist almost in parallel to the work, and you know, there's some writing that's maybe. I mean, Louise made artist statements or interviews. These are more public-facing statements of intent, or not explanation, but it's what Louise wanted to convey, you know, to an audience in a public way. The psychoanalytic writings that I've been working on for such a long time are much more personal. These were never intended for publication. So, I mean, very intimate details of her relationships, of her life, of her feelings about her family. I think that the graphic quality of the handwritten writings can be similar to drawings and vice versa. There's often, it seems like sometimes the line disappears between the two of them. And then there's, you know, statements that are more sort of, I mean, I wouldn't say that letters are intermediate because they're just addressed to another person. And so I think I'm very interested in Ulf's research and what, you know, the publication of these letters, because I think there will be a revelation of a less understood facet of Louise's career. I mean, not just the 1960s, which in general has been, I think, somewhat overshadowed by the personages and the cells and the spiders and the fabric sculptures, but also the importance of Robert for Louise. As Ulf explained, he was a very distinguished art historian. It was a complicated relationship. There were a lot of ups and downs, but it was, I think, a meeting of minds. And I think he learned a lot about art from being with Louise, and I think they shared love, you know, love of symbolism, of many things. And yeah, I think that the...
She said that she married her mother. No?
Well, she said that once, yeah. No, she said that, you know, when she introduced Robert to her father, and her father told some kind of crude French joke, and it was sort of, you know, sexist, and Robert just sat there and looked at him, and she said, that's when I knew I loved him. And, you know, Louise later said, well, I married my mother. So she was, I mean, she wanted to get away from her father, and then I think it was complicated, but there's no question that I think Robert thought she was a great artist. Robert deeply believed in her.
Yes, I mean, he wrote the most wonderful love letters to her, and just saying, at one point when she was really very depressed, and he did the mistake of all art historians who are married to artists, because the art historians think they should help the artists because they know how things will develop, and this is a big mistake. You should leave them alone. Anyway, but at that point he helps her to do a show in Paris, and he takes the boys to doing a trip in west of France, and she's there, and she wouldn't do it, but at that point he's sort of writing to her how important she is for him, and how important that would be for her to do this show. And at one point he says, everything I know about art I owe to you. And I mean, he is an art historian, you know, wrote a big dissertation on primitive art and painting, and well-established professor, but this is what he says, and it's really beautiful to read. And but you see, there is this interesting misunderstanding between art history and artists, very well, full on display.
Yeah. No, at the same time, is ambiguity between her private life and their artworks. For example, today you beautifully explained the recurrent number 5 in many works. There is this beautiful work with a little tree with 5 leaves representing the 5 members of the family. The fountain, probably we can show some of the images in the back. The fountain, which is a masterpiece with 5 groups of breasts, again representing the members of the family. The ambiguity between the biographical events and how they morph constantly into an artwork or into a set of artworks. This is very interesting. The family is a central theme. 5 breasts very often appearing. And
but this is, I think it's very important to clarify. Louise is often described as a confessional artist, and she both plays into that tendency, because obviously she is working from her autobiography, and I think she also had a compulsion to confess, and she used her art to do that. But it's never, and her knowledge of art history was very deep. She was an intellectual. She was very sophisticated and aware of art historical references. We talked earlier today about Laocoon in relation to the snakes, and I think, even if it wasn't an inspiration, it would have been aware of it, and so I think that. The number 5, Louise is really on one level a symbolist artist, and she's taking, the number 5 is her own personal code for the 5 members of the family that she was born into, and the 5 members of the family that she had with Robert in New York. And family relations are, always key for Louise, and they become articulated in different ways in the work. So here in this beautiful fountain, Mamels, which is exhibited here for the first time in New York, in Hong Kong, you have this horizontal frieze of breast-like objects that are sort of set into a kind of architectural channel, and 5 of the nipples are emitting water that fall into a basin below. And this is one of very few fountain pieces that Louise made. She did make other works like Self-Returner and another work called Fountain. And water for Louise really was a symbol of the passage of time. Wolf mentioned the Eau de la Bièvre. I think what the water always conveys a sense of past and presence and this sort of like endless, ceaseless onward march of time. But yes, so here you see Mamels was cast also in pink rubber, and there's also a version in marble. I think we might have an image of that. There it is. Carved in marble, not cast in marble. The point is, Louise would shift between materials not because she had a particular, she wasn't into marble for marble's sake. She was interested in how it would allow her to capture a different aspect of a psychological state or a relationship or a theme. And so, in a way, this piece, which again we're showing here for the first time, takes on another dimension because it has this water component. But it's a motif that Louise, had used before, and I think this is the nature of how Louise was working. There is a kind of, the towers that she showed at Turbine Hall in 2000 were called I Do, I Undo, I Redo. And much of Louise's work is of that nature, where she shifts from one theme to another theme, leaves it will sometimes go into hiding for 20 years, and then suddenly it surfaces again. And so I think that these are, in a way, Louise's reworking of them in different materials, again, is an attempt to capture something, another facet of the emotional truth that she's hoping to express.
Yeah. In one of the unbelievable aspects of this fountain is a landscape. At the same time, is a healing and nurturing landscape, because water gives life. Probably this is a bit extreme and very personal, but I really envision here a new possibility of looking even at land art. Recently there was a major beautiful sculpture by Louise Bourgeois installed in the Bangkok Art Biennial in a temple with 2 eyes that really resemble breasts. And is about huge, gigantic marble, black marble sculptures that again allude to the fact that the land is not outside us and is not just a passive receptacle, but is a nurturing land. I think that the fact that many female artists today look at the land, specifically land art, from the point of view of nurturing environment, is something that really is already embryonically present in Louise Bourgeois' representation of the landscape. Very often the landscape are breasts, heels of breasts, and even in the gallery there is this phenomenal portrait of solitude, as you defined it before, which is a wonderful take on the notion of landscape as a nurturing milk or nurturing water, primordial water, which would be quite radical in the form of.
Yes, so this is almost a portrait of a landscape without any people, and so the mark making is very fine. It's very tight. In order for her to be able to, she's working by scratching the board, which has been painted, in order to reveal the white lines. And it's reminiscent of her landscape drawings from the early 1950s, but also of the printmaking process, which is a very important thing for Louise. Louise was a great printmaker throughout her life, and there's always this sort of tension with Louise where she, Sartre said hell is other people, and Louise countered that by saying, I reject what Sartre said, hell is the absence of the other people. So for her is the absence of the other. The relationship to other people defined her identity, whether that's her husband or her assistant Jerry Gorovoy or, her psychoanalyst. Louise always had to define her identity in relation to another. And I think that's part of the part of the richness of the work is that it never occurs without that sort of, that awareness. So even though this is a landscape that's quite, it's very beautiful, but it's also, there's a chilling or kind of melancholy quality to it because, again, it's a landscape without people. Just to return to the breast fountain, something I wanted to say is that Louise often used images of breast giving milk in the later work, and partly it's because of her, she was interested in the idea of the good mother. Now, so the mother is represented by the milk it gives breast for the young, but it's also that Louise, in her old age, felt like the child, and she felt like the child who was in search of the good mother. This was part of her interest, because as she got older and more frail and dependent on other people, she felt she needed a mother to come and take care of her. So, even though you have this, one aspect of the work is the family relation, the 5 nipples that are, emitting water, it's also Louise addressing her mother, too, at the same time. So, it's often there are many layers and they sort of coexist with each other in a single work.
Mother Earth is really a form of landscape which is nurturing, which recurs in this generosity of the breast feeding us. And, yeah. What is, in a way, you mentioned before about these floating elements and the floating sculptures that are going to be the core of the exhibition in Beyeler. We saw like a beautiful example of the spirals that are floating in the gallery. The spiral is an essential figure in Bourgeois' work, symbolically, mathematically, because she was studying mathematics, and is basically about controlling chaos, as she mentioned in a text which is a wall text in the gallery. How do you envision like the recurring theme of the spiral and the circles in your work, and do they play like an important role in your exhibition as well?
Yes, they will. I can't really reveal that would be something like a spoiler. You should come and see it. But I'm thinking of doing a spiral-like architecture at one point. The other thing, of course, is that I relate this spiral is something again something reassuring. I think so. It brings order in the chaos. And we have these spiral hanging, these aluminum sculptures, which are again sort of this gravity, and it finds its place in space. The thing with these hanging pieces is I think I should tell this story, but she always referred to her teacher, Fernand Léger. Fernand Léger, she was a student of Fernand Léger, famous French master of modernism. And at one point, Fernand Léger took this piece of wood and put it on a wire and put it in space and said, "Louise, you should do sculpture. This is sculpture." And this is a hanging piece, which sort of, if you hang something, it moves a little, then it finds stability. And I think she kept that in mind all her life, and developed this wonderful idea of the hanging sculpture. The hanging sculpture is very much, I think, related to this idea of the spiral, because the spiral is like a movement in itself, and it's like it's at one point it's stopping because you are at the center or you are outside or whatever, and it's sort of it becomes
an abyss.
Yes. So I think yes, the spiral will play a very big role in the exhibition. Yes, absolutely.
This anecdote of Léger with the floating piece of wood becomes probably fundamental even in the genesis of the personage, because the personage basically is a multiplication of a module that is repeated several times.
Well, some of the later personages, the earlier personages are carved out of a single piece of wood, and they sometimes have elements that hang from them. In fact, you could say, a work like Woman with Packages or Persistent Antagonism, we don't have images, unfortunately, that have hanging components, are really the predecessors of the hanging pieces that begin to emerge in the 1960s. That, and some of the hanging forms in the wonderful paintings that have recently been receiving a lot more attention. I think that the later personages that you reference were often made in a slightly different way. They had many different component parts, and they would be set on a single vertical axis, and Louise could adjust it. So it wasn't fixed. It wasn't like a one-shot sculpture. It was something that she could revisit and recalibrate. And so even these were made when she had just entered analysis, had been in analysis for a year or two. So I think something of the nature of the sculpture probably corresponded to what she was going through in analysis, that there was a way of revisiting, retelling the story of your life, looking back at things and trying to understand it in a different way. And but on the other hand, these block-like sculptures like Memling Dawn, them look forward to minimalism, to the repetition of a single, nearly identical element, the seriality. And one of the things that interests me more and more about Louise's work is how she works in series. Whether it's in the late gouaches or in some of the unique print variants that I think will play a part in your show. And not to give the game away, but I think that'll be part of the the presentation there. I think that Louise is a great formalist over and above. I think the story that people most know about Louise is the biographical side. These are emotionally charged works, psychologically charged. But again, I think Louise's range of formal invention is really astonishing. And one of the things I hope to do in the show is to kind of highlight that, through, the sort of unifying thread of landscape, to show how, Louise is constantly searching for new forms and never really arrives at a signature style. So,
I loved how in the works in the gallery, she even inverts, like in a spiral, in a constant spiral, a positive and negative. The positive of the personage becomes the negative of the crate that was used to fix the personage. It's really like in a spiral. All of a sudden, what is positive is negative, and she starts working on the emptiness to create a cavity, a stage set. Snakes. Probably we can show some pictures of these beautiful new works. That
explain more like how these things function. That's
how they function.
Yeah,
yes. These are made from the interior of crates that Louise used to transport her personage sculptures, and she liked the shape of the form and decided to use them to create these wall reliefs, these wall-mounted reliefs, and they're landscapes. They're at the same time they're two-dimensional and three-dimensional at the same time. They're sculptural, and she placed them in these. The photos really don't do them justice. So whoever hasn't seen the show should please come and see them in the real, because they're much, much more. It barely captures the texture and the richness of the material. But they have a very bodily feeling to them. They're very visceral. So they're landscapes organized around a hollow. Louise had a beautiful quote to that effect. And, Louise also had this doubling where, she would take the landscape, I feel like she would introject the landscape into her psyche and then project it out onto the landscape. And so there's this kind of inward and outward movement. She's looking at the landscape is being made over and transformed by Louise's psychic processing of it. And so even though they're not realistic landscapes, you recognize them as such, and yet they're transformed, they're changed. And there's something also in the fact that Louise, begins working with these found objects late in life, and that was important for her. It's a new development that really begins to take place in the early 1990s with the cells, with the fabric sculpture, Louise is, up until then, has mostly made her sculptural forms, but then she begins reappropriating things from her past, like the clothing, most famously, maybe. But parts of her Brooklyn studio would end up being, incorporated into her cells. And so I see these great pieces as part of that same, developing logic in Louise's making. And
but you see, the pieces we see here are the devices who keep the personage stable.
Yes.
Stabilizer,
Yes,
exactly.
Because the personages are not stable at all. They're alone. They need to have a base. And she did. When she began to do it, she leaned them on the wall. Because all the early personages for me are about instability.
That's
very
correct.
much so.
Yeah.
And now she uses the device which keeps the personage stable to make art.
I think it's a very beautiful thing, what you just said. I think the personages, for those who don't know, were originally bolted directly into the floor. And part of Louise's radicality as an artist was even by the late 1940s, was getting rid of the pedestal and displaying the work in an environmental way so that you would have an experiential encounter with them. She said the personages should be like going to see people at a cocktail party where you're moving among them. And but they were portraits of her instability. They were top heavy and could easily fall over. So, as Ulf said, it's sort of it's a nice kind of, there's a kind of poetic justice in coming to use them in the end for a source of psychological satisfaction and security later on.
They are the landscapes of the personage in a way. These create. Give stability to them, and at the same time it becomes the extension of the personage into its environment. So it can be seen as the landscape of the personage.
And of course, again, because they're object-like, because they're in these metal boxes, they take on a different sense of space. So it's as if she's taken it and flipped it up onto the wall in a strange way. Yeah.
And this is again the number 5, as you mentioned before.
Yeah, so 2 of the 4 works that we have here have interiors that are populated by internal elements that she designed, and 2 of them are simply empty. Yeah.
There is one, the largest one, that resembles the killing of the father. The large, this one exactly, reminds me of the large installation. Is it correct, the killing of the father?
Do you mean the Clouds and Caverns?
Yes.
That's in the show in Taiwan, from the 1978.
Yeah. Can you explain better this work, which is so important, so iconic for her?
Well, Louise begins, also in the drawings in the late 1960s, Louise begins making these kumul-like landscapes, sort of repetitive mound-like or breast-like forms. And so, again, there is this doubling of the repetition of the breast symbol that, you see in a very different way in a later work like Mamel's. So that's what she's used, and it's almost, you could say, like a self-reference of sorts in this kind of, the landscape within the landscape is a bourgeois landscape. And so it's a very beautiful piece, and this would have been one of the larger personages because of the size of the opening. You can see that there are various different, almost like bays or nooks that would have held the sculpture in place while it's being transported.
Yeah. As I said before, she's playing with the idea of a third dimension, putting sort of opening the landscape to the third dimension. And Clouds and Caverns is, I think, a very key piece for that, because it's like a 3-dimensional painting in a way. It has one side to look at.
It's a frontal piece.
Yes, yeah.
And it's also, but some of them are, sort of semicircular painted wooden elements. Others are, hollow metallic structures of the same shape, the same semicircular shape. So exactly, there's a kind of play there between what's full and what's hollow and what's seen from the front and what's not. Yeah.
There is another form of a landscape that is revealed in the exhibition with these works from 1986 that are made of dots, made of holes into the wood.
You mean the small wood?
The small ones that are then connected with scratches or connected with threads. Can you explain better this?
Yeah, this is a beautiful piece that was shown once before in a show in Somerset. And you see we have again the number 5. This is probably a reference to the family. And one of the pieces ends in a spiral, which is how this piece ended up in the same room as the Labyrinthine Tower and the diptych of the two snake pieces. And by boring into the wood and then painting it, Louise gives a sense of blending 2 and 3 dimensions in these smaller works.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think always, throughout her life and throughout her writings as well, Louise was always recalibrating the relationship among the family members, examining them. The writings are full of references to saying, I do this, Robert does that, Michelle does this. She's always it's like this kind of trying to pin down the differences between them, but also the relations among them at the same time. And so I think
there is actually one other aspect that I never really considered before it became evident today, which is the use of color in Bourgeois. Of course, the red is the most iconic color when we think about Bourgeois. Later in her life, there are beautiful blue drawings, but I saw fantastic yellow today in one of the sculptures with the frame of the crates. And I was wondering if you have ever thought about the color in Bourgeois. Probably it is quite, I would say, like an unexplored theme about her work. Yet it plays a crucial role. The red and the blue in the spiral, they're fantastic colors. The yellow, and I don't know if...
Well, when I go home, I will keep the yellow in mind. It's very dominant, as you say, in this show. It's really interesting, and my first encounters with Louise's work were of course influenced by the red. I thought it was blood or whatever, and that's true. But this is for me. This is something I have to develop. It's one of the advantages of this show that it introduces yellow. I might have seen pieces of yellow in her work, but that I will definitely take home this interesting color, which I think, which for me is unusual in her work until now. It might change, but of course she works with color a lot. She's doing these fabric pieces, Eau de la Bièvre, which I like a lot, for example, which is made of clothes she wore, and of course she's using that color and uses color combinations. It's very striking, but perhaps it's that she's painting herself. That's perhaps not that dominant in her work in my eyes until now. Next show I will discover something else. I don't know. What's your thinking about
I think there are certain colors that were very important to Louise. Red, obviously, but then she liked a certain color of blue that she was actually more like a sky blue, but she called Prussian blue. It was her own version of it. Black was a color for her of melancholy and depression. Other colors less, and then there was green, which she would never use. Louise said green, the green-eyed monster is a way of describing jealousy in English. And Louise suffered terrifying, I think really debilitating jealousy throughout her life of other people, of family members, and so I think that was a way of just keeping that at bay. And so almost like a superstition. Yellow is not a color that she used all that often, and that's why it's interesting to see it here. But it doesn't. I don't know that it has such a clearly defined meaning for her.
And the patina of the fountain, because it's interesting, it looks like terracotta, but it's bronze.
It's a bronze, and if without the patina, it would be a much darker, like a chocolate brown. And so she's treated it with this patina, I think, to give it a slightly more livelier look and to kind of lighten up the tone of the piece. And it also has, to me at least, a kind of slightly archaic feeling, as you said, a bit like terracotta. And this is, it's a piece that can go indoors or outdoors. So, if it were to go outdoors, of course, the patina would change more dramatically over time. Yeah.
Then there's pink. In rubber, she uses the color of the material, or the marble color of the different colors.
It's like the pink marble.
The pink marble thing, of course.
Before giving the word to the audience for any questions, I would like to congratulate with Philip, because I have the privilege to see many Bourgeois exhibitions, but this one in the gallery is extraordinary, and it really casts a light on a completely new works by Bourgeois that really cast interpretations and open up again potentials on her work, which is unpredictable and unexpected. It's really, I invite everyone to go to see the show, because it's really beautiful and unexpected. Once I talked with some of my former colleagues and in Zurich, and they told me that when they open the crates, sometimes you see masterpieces, sometimes you see works by artists that are just good works but not amazing. And they said, whenever you open a crate of Bourgeois, there is always the sparkle of uniqueness and intelligence. Even in the little drawings, even in the little collage, there is always like this wit and this intelligence and this radicality, which is unique. And I have to say that this shows really unveils again another beautiful depth about her work, and I really wish that you can go. So before concluding, I would like to ask the audience if there are questions.
Thank you so much for this really very wonderful talk. So it's less a question, more it is a question, the floating body. I actually have been thinking for 20 years about this body of work. It's more of a feeling, because the spiral to me is quite symbolic. Creation is spiral. Creation is spiral in all. Spiral is like a symbol for it, yeah. But then the other thing about grace and gravity, I didn't think about this until probably 5-6 years ago. One day, suddenly, when I saw the hanging, floating body, I thought about grace and gravity, because human being, we are both earthly and a celestial being. So we have one part is like landscape. Our body is like a loan from the Mother Earth, but we have something else from somewhere we don't know. And so this trauma, this personal or collective trauma as a human, it's from, the family, the ancestor, like all this suffering is, to me, it's more from the earthly being. So I always have this feeling like, maybe intuitively, when she put them hanging, floating in the air, this alignment is like unite the earth and the sky. Like, if you talk even further about the ancient myths, like we human, how we came to this universe, the beginning, there was no divide between earth and the sky. And that's what I want to ask you about.
I think you can see some. If you look at a piece like Arch of Hysteria, which is now at the Fubon Museum, but was shown in Tokyo against a beautiful view of the Tokyo skyline. This is a sculpture that Louise made of. It was a cast from the body of her assistant Jerry Gorovoy, and created a kind of perfect O, a perfect shape of and. The sculpture is hanging from the navel, the representation of the navel. And I think that it's not to say that every hanging piece is a portrait of a baby or a portrait of a child connected to the mother, but certainly some of them, I think, are. And so there is this idea of a state of extreme vulnerability and dependency in the hanging pieces. And sometimes it relates to the navel, sometimes it relates to this. I think she is thinking of herself, especially in the late work, as a kind of child in the womb. But yeah, I think inevitably too the hanging pieces tend, they unify and complicate our perception of the sort of the vertical and the horizontal axis and the way things come together, in those two planes. Ulf, do you?
Yes, I agree. I mean, again, you see that her work is really very much about human existence. I mean, she's really thinking about this, and every one of these works represent this very interestingly. Yeah.
Questions from the audience?
Hello, Hausers. Good afternoon, and thank you for your sharing. Based on your conversation, I feel like you guys have a really deep understanding of LB's work as well as her personal experience. So my question is, like, this is the second time LB exhibiting her works in Hong Kong. So I'm wondering, like, in the process of you curating her show at HW, like, what's the theme? Like, what are some components for you deciding, well, this time the theme is called soft landscape? And because her show is very, like, personal story, as well as her, our reflection of her inner world. So I'm wondering, like, when you're curating her works, especially in Asia, like, will there have some special elements you guys will relate her work to, especially our Asian culture, or like how will you introduce the artist's work to Asia?
Well, I guess in the case of a show like the show that's at Fubon, it's really a kind of representative survey of Louise's work. So we have early pieces, we have paintings, we have sculptures from the 60s, we have two major cells. So it gives an overview of Louise's work, but it's organized according to a theme, and that narrative is meant to unpack and kind of reveal the things that were important to Louise and what she was trying to express. So it's not just a straight A to B to C to D kind of exhibition. The show at the gallery is, again, trying to showcase. It's a much more focused exhibition, a more focused project, you could say. Because the lens is not as wide. It's not trying to show everything. And the idea there was really to showcase something that would be different from the works that had been seen in Hong Kong before, and to take this opportunity to premiere a number of pieces that have never been shown before. So I think that is, I mean, Hong Kong is a sophisticated art-going public. I don't think there's any need to make a show that's, specially tailored to Hong Kong. But again, I think that the relationship to traditional Chinese landscape painting, for example, might cause these landscapes to be read in a different way. And I'm interested to hear back from the gallery and from the press about how, what the response is over the course of the show.
Interesting. So I bet there will have some special fusion between, like, culturally or artistically.
I think that, it's really, Louise's work has a universality to it, because in many ways she's dealing with emotional themes that we all face, that we all deal with. That's why I think, even though she was absolutely a feminist in her life, she resisted being described as a feminist artist. And she wanted, her work was really about themes that were mostly pre-gender, and she was very much, dealing with her own fear of abandonment, this kind of primordial fear of abandonment. And a lot of the emotions that, were grounded in that complex. So I think, again, this is, possibly could be understood in a different way in China or in Hong Kong. But, the show that I curated at the Long Museum in 2018 was called The Eternal Thread. The title, The Eternal Thread, comes from Louise's writings, and it means the eternal thread is you. So the eternal thread is you. The relationship to the other person is sacrosanct, it's transcendent, it's all important. I later learned that there was a myth in China about a red thread joining the feet of destined lovers, and this was not the original intention. It was like a nice happenstance. But again, this is just an example to show how one artist's preoccupation or psychological specificity can be read in a different way in a different cultural context.
Thank you.
Hello. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about the idea of the fold in Louise Bourgeois' work, and I'm thinking of it in relations to perhaps, Deleuze and Guattari's writing about, the fold and the productive and generative potentiality of the fold in, Baroque art, and how that sort of, how Louise Bourgeois sees the fold in her practice.
I think that Louise wouldn't have been thinking of Deleuze. That's not a reference that would have meant much to her. She wasn't terribly enamored of the French philosophers who emerged in the 60s and 70s. I mean, she had a gripe against Lacan because she felt that he was, a bullshitter, and he was just talking for talk's sake, and that he'd taken Freudian theory and kind of abstracted it and theorized it without having necessarily made any pioneering discoveries of his own, and that where Freud's theories, whether you like them or not, were based on clinical observation of patients, where Lacan in many cases was working from an already existing body. I mean, you go on about it, but I think the fold for Louise is really, it's both bodily and psychological at the same time. And so again, it could be the folds, like the inner recesses of the body. I mean, some of these pieces in the show, it's like seeing an X-ray or like a cross-section, something that's been cut open, and you can see into the internal circuitry of the human body. But it's also on a psychological level, a recess, or like this kind of something that's pulling you in, this intense sense of interiority, like the maze of one's own psyche. I think that is the primary meaning of it for Louise. But it is something that's quite salient in certain pieces in this show, I think, in the inner folds of the body.
I would like to expand, because the fold in Deleuze becomes a topological device, something that subverts the relationship between inside and outside. And the landscape that you showed in the project, really in the exhibition, really unfold and articulate very beautifully this constant ambiguity, which is the ambiguity of the spiral, where something which is inside becomes outside, and what is outside the landscape becomes introverted. This tension which is never resolved between inside and outside, these topological conditions, like a Möbius or a Klein battle or a media strip. This actually is the contradictions that Louise Bourgeois embodies in her works. No, everything is really about this constant folding of one into the other, male into female, female into male, outside into inside, inside into outside, and so on. So in a way, probably it is like an interesting key to read her work in a new way.
That's wonderful black piece lying on the floor, which is the title I forgot.
Is Layer.
Yes, layer. It's the layer. It's very, very important. It's sort of it's going inside and sort of trying to sort of develop from. Yes, this one. Yes.
Yeah.
That is a fold.
Yeah.
Well.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thank you, Philip. Thank you, Ulf. And I really hope you can go to see the exhibition, because it's wonderful. Thank you very much.